Hi everyone, my name is Gio Rapacciuolo. I'm a research scientist at the California Academy of Sciences, and today I wanted to share some insights on how to increase the usefulness of crowdsourced community science observations for biodiversity research and management. If we go over to GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, we find that over 60% of species occurrence records in the repository are community science observations, and 6 of the top 10 datasets in terms of number of records are community science datasets. This represents a huge proportion of our current knowledge of the global spatial and temporal distribution of biodiversity. One of these amazing community science projects is iNaturalist, which I will be talking about today. Briefly, in case you're not familiar with it, iNaturalist is developed at the California Academy of Sciences and includes a social network, phone app, and a community of volunteer naturalists who collect and identify biodiversity photos and observations over space and time and across the web of life. It is important to note that while iNaturalist observations happen throughout the year by single users, it is often large organized community science campaigns which truly boost iNaturalist activity and the number of observations for certain areas, times, and taxa. An example is Snapshot CalCoast, which provided a lot of the data we'll be showing here today, and is a statewide effort to document biodiversity throughout the California coast every summer, spearheaded by Rebecca Johnson and Alison Young, co-directors of community science at the California Academy of Sciences. As you can see from this animation, community contributed observations of biodiversity crowdsourced via iNaturalist have been increasing rapidly on the California coast. In addition, you can also notice the large pulses in observation activity every summer since 2016 as a result of the Snapshot CalCoast engagement campaign. This incredible stream of information happens in real time and at both high resolutions and extensive space, time, and taxonomy, extremely difficult to achieve via any other data collection approaches. Given the volume, resolution, and extent of community contributed observations, these data from iNaturalist and similar projects have tremendous potential to help monitor and understand biodiversity for both research and management. And so it is important that we work to fully realize this potential and figure out how to make the most out of these data. This is where two California state agencies, the Ocean Protection Council and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, had incredible foresight to fund a pilot project aimed at building the capacity to use crowdsourced community science data to monitor biodiversity across California's coastal and marine protected areas. The main question we set out to answer in this project was, how can we make the best use of crowdsourced and unstructured community contributed observations to extract signals of biodiversity change over space and time that can also be useful for management? In the first 18 months of this project, we spent a great deal of time testing approaches to control for variation in observer effort and activity over space, time, and taxonomy when deriving indicators of biodiversity from unstructured community contributed observations. We distilled available approaches into a 4-step recipe for increasing the usefulness of these data to detect biodiversity change. In the interest of time, I can't go through all 4 steps in detail here, but I will walk you through a few examples of some of the most useful approaches we found. You can find out more about our developing methodology at calcoast.dob.bio/methodology. First, we found that aggregating groups of iNaturalist observations based on their metadata to borrow strength across space, time, and taxa is absolutely key when analyzing these data. This means identifying a spatial, temporal, and taxonomic footprint to define discrete observation events, which then become the primary units of analysis as opposed to single observations. You can think of the points in the figure on the slide as individual organisms observed on iNaturalist, the shapes indicating different species, while the grid overlaid on top represents the spatial, temporal, and taxonomic footprint selected to aggregate observations into discrete observation events. As an example, we often aggregated all iNaturalist observations of all species made by a single user on a given day within a 2-kilometer radius into a discrete observation event. Doing so enables data users to characterize observation events based on attributes related to observation effort. For instance, this allows distinguishing the two observation events A and B here, where visit A has generated a few opportunistic observations over approximately 20 minutes and 100 meters, while visit B looks a lot more like a comprehensive survey, generating more than 100 observations over nearly 3 hours and a 1-kilometer radius. This great recent paper by Tom August and colleagues explores a range of observer effort and behavior metrics that can be derived from the simple metadata collected with crowdsourced community-contributed observations. Another key advantage of aggregating data is the ability to borrow strength across taxa. This means using data from taxa other than the focal species to help account for observation biases in the focal species itself, by indicating overall patterns of observation effort and therefore highlighting potential false absences. This figure shows how a clustering algorithm can reveal the species that tend to be observed concurrently in the same places, at the same times, and by the same observers, and therefore the species that are likely to provide information on each other's occurrence. As an example, let's say we're interested in the population trend of the ochre sea star, Pysasta ocraceus. As expected, given the increase in observers and observations over time, the number of observations for the species in red here is increasing monotonically and does not reflect the species ecological process on the California coast. However, what we really want to do is to also look at the trend in observations for a set of species related with the ochre sea star. That is, species that tend to be observed in the same places at the same times and by the same observers. This will help us take into account overall observation effort and minimize the noise in the data. Indeed, when we look at observations of the ochre sea star as a function of observations of species associated with it, we get the proportional rate of observation for this species on iNaturalist, also known as the reporting rate. This trend now looks much closer to what we would expect for the species on the California coast, with a large decline in the species numbers due to the strong negative impacts of sea star wasting disease. So how reliable are these relatively simple trends exactly? We have begun to validate species trends derived from our iNaturalist with trends derived from standardized survey data on the California coast, and found that the proportional rate of observation on iNaturalist frequently captures species' true population trends quite closely. However, there are also many instances of disagreement between the proportional rate of observation on iNaturalist and standardized monitoring trends. We have begun to analyze the correlates of agreement versus disagreement, and preliminary results suggest that the higher the local population size, the larger the number of iNaturalist observations, and the more drastic the population's fluctuations, the higher the reliability of iNaturalist-derived population trends. Ultimately, crowdsourced community-contributed data should not be thought of as a replacement, but as a complement for standardized monitoring data. Fortunately, recent developments in point process modeling frameworks, such as the one developed by Fithian et al., mean that users need no longer choose between these two data types, but instead can combine them to exploit their respective strengths. Using this approach, smaller quantities of presence-absence data from standardized monitoring surveys can help to pinpoint biases in presence-only community-contributed data, while larger amounts of community-contributed data can help to fill gaps in the sparse coverage of monitoring data. Doing exactly this, we modeled the density and distribution of a subset of rocky intertidal species on the US West Coast. Specifically, we integrated crowdsourced community-contributed data from iNaturalist with standardized long-term monitoring survey data within a joint species distribution modeling framework, which also statistically accounted for known biases in iNaturalist observations. These models enabled us to estimate the density of a subset of species across the California coast and the relationships between their density and underlying environmental gradients. In this example here, we show that the pink volcano barnacle is found in higher densities in warmer waters and is therefore limited by minimum sea surface temperature at its northern range limit. As a result, our models also estimate that in recent years, the species has experienced a northward shift in its northern range limit on the California coast. By navigating to calcoast.dob.bio, you can find out more about our project, the approaches we're using, as well as interact with the outputs we are developing. We have now started a new phase of this project, adapting our approaches to detect biodiversity change from community-contributed data to address the management need for an early warning and forecasting system for biodiversity change on the California coast. The main approach for the early warning system will be to focus our modeling efforts on species of management importance, both native and non-native, particularly likely to be vulnerable to or benefit from environmental change on the California coast. And then engage community scientists in making observations of these species in particular. At the core of this approach, the targeted engagement of volunteers will provide high-value information to update models and forecasts of abundance and distribution changes for target species, and in turn, mobilize community scientists to fill data gaps and ground truth model predictions. I will leave you with my take-home message. Our work has begun to show that when treated appropriately, crowdsourced community-contributed observations from our naturalist and similar efforts can provide useful estimates of biodiversity change and can become a key biodiversity monitoring and management tool on the California coast and beyond. Thank you very much for your attention, and please do not hesitate to contact me with any questions. Thank you.